18th century economic developments. How did the Western European trading nations create a global consumer economy during the 18th century? Through trade and colonialism and using methods like mercantilism to bring these exotic products back to Europe. Mercantilism is the belief in the benefits and profitability in trading, like commercialism. In 18th century Europe, mercantilism was the economic theory practiced commonly that promoted governmental regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival national powers. It was the economic counterpart of political abolition. Mercantilism was based on the idea that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and reducing imports. It's characterized by the belief that global wealth was static and that a nation's economic health relied heavily on its supply of capital. An example of mercantilism was the Sugar Act of 1764, which made colonialists in America have to pay higher tariffs and duties on imports of foreign-made refined sugar products. Mercantilism is an economic policy that is designed to maximize the exports and minimize the imports for an economy. A plantation economy is an economy based on agricultural mass production, usually of a few commodity crops grown on large farms worked by laborers or slaves. The properties are called plantations. Plantation economies rely on the export of cash crops as a source of income. During the 18th century, harvests improved for a number of reasons. New agricultural techniques such as crop rotation were more widely used, and improved agricultural machinery increased farmers' productivity, and new crops were introduced such as potatoes and corn. These improved human and animal nutrition. Although sugar arrived in Europe around 1100, it was not widely used until the 16th century. Until then, it was reserved for those who had wealth, for both sweetening food and as medicine. Sugar production increased alongside demand, feeding the bellies and imagination of European consumers. They treated sugar as a medicine, preservative, ingredient, and artistic medium. Between 1766 and 1791, sugar was produced by the British West Indies, and they produced over 1 million tons of sugar. Growing sugar was hard, intensive labor, and was done under the hot West Indian sun. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest long-distance forced movement of people in recorded history. From the 16th to late 19th centuries, over 12 million African men, women, and children were enslaved, transported to the Americas, and bought and sold primarily by European and Euro-American slaveholders as chattel property used for their labor and skills. The transatlantic slave trade was one leg of a three-part system known as the triangular trade. The forming of the triangle began when European ships carrying firearms and manufactured goods sailed to Africa, where the commodities were traded for enslaved men, women, and children. The Europeans, on the other hand, greatly benefited from the Atlantic trade, since it allowed them to amass the raw materials that fed the Industrial Revolution to the detriment of African societies whose capacity to transform their modes of production into a viable entrepreneurial economy was severely halted. Following the British and United States' ban on the African trade in 1807, it declined, but the period after still accounted for 28.5% of the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1818 and 1860, over 3.5 million slaves were transported, with 850,000 in the 1820s. The East India Company was an English and later British joint stock company founded in 1600 and dissolved in 1874. It was formed to trade in the Indian Ocean region, initially with the East Indies and later with East Asia. The British East India Company also traded cotton, silk, indigo, saltpeter, and tea, as well as transported slaves. It became involved with politics and acted as an agent of British imperialism in India from the early 18th century to the mid-19th century. From the late 18th century, it gradually lost both commercial and political control. The original aim of the East India Company was to trade. The company was chartered by Queen Elizabeth I for trade with Asia. The original object of the group of merchants involved was to break the Dutch monopoly of the spice trade with the East Indies. The effect of the British East India Company were very strong and widespread. It helped the establishment of the British Empire. It was a turning point in the history of economics and set the trends for several centuries to come. Globalization is another significant influence of this company.